Well, the United States has been very jealous of its sovereignty until very recently. It's striking that under this administration, we are getting very warm noises about the International Criminal Court, about the Kyoto-Copenhagen process, about powers for the United Nations, and so on. The current administration backed what strikes me as a very dangerous precedent, which was the decision by the International Criminal Court to indict the head of state of Sudan. Now, the head of state of Sudan, by any measure, is an unutterable swine. I mean, it's difficult to think of a worse. He has been responsible for the deaths and displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. He is a nasty, brutal dictator. But here's the key thing. Sudan never signed the ICC treaty. So think about the precedent we're setting, that you can now enforce a treaty on a country that declined to sign it. Right? Can you be absolutely certain that you're not setting a precedent that is going to allow your soldiers, your politicians, your decision makers one day to be dragged in front of courts whose jurisdiction you never recognized? Charles de Gaulle once said that democracy and national sovereignty are the same thing. Now that sounds a quite bizarre statement until you stop and think about it. You go back to the people who first had this idea of democracy back in the 18th century, this extraordinary idea that everybody should have a vote on what to do, government by and for the people. That immediately raises the question, what people? Right? In other words, within what unit are we going to decide these things? What's the right place to have these arguments? And the early Democrats, the radicals of the 18th and early 19th centuries, when they wrestled with this question, they came up with what is in truth the only possible answer to that question, which is the right unit for a democracy is a unit within which people feel enough in common with one another to accept government from each other's hands. And that means a nation. Now, a nation is generally defined by language, by religion, by culture. Not always. I mean, Switzerland is a very clear national unit. The Swiss have a very strong sense of being Swiss, despite speaking 4 languages. It can come from all sorts of different roots, but ultimately it's a self-defining sense of community of identity. We belong together. If I lose an election, I don't immediately want to walk out. I try and convince my fellow countrymen. That's what a nation is. Now, that exists in Portugal, in Britain, in Norway, in Canada. It does not exist in the European Union. Almost nobody feels European in the same sense that somebody might feel French or Spanish or Russian or Japanese. And a consequence of that is that there is no functioning democracy. I mean, yes, people have votes for the European Parliament. I was myself elected 3 times to it. But democracy doesn't just mean that you can occasionally put a cross on a bit of paper. It also means that you have to identify with the institution that you're electing, that there has to be some relationship between government and governed. The proof of how weak this is in Europe is in the turnout figures. I got in at the first election that I was elected in on a turnout of 24%. More people voted the following day in the eviction round of the then series of Big Brother than participated in the election that returned me to the European Parliament. Okay? And the turnout has been falling solidly in every election in Europe. Every European Parliament election has a lower participation rate than the previous one. People just don't identify. They don't have that sense of demos, of common affinity at European level. And that's why ultimately the European Union is a non-democratic system. It has to compel by force of law what it can't ask in the name of patriotism.